Hello, welcome. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Stephanie LaRue. I am the Associate Director at CSREA, the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. CSREA is an interdisciplinary hub that aims to build community with the public and among scholars and students working on race and ethnicity in and around the United States. We invite you to learn more about our programs and offerings on our website, www.brown.edu/race. Today's event, entitled Critical Conversations, Race, Education, and Inequality, is the first of a two-part roundtable discussion that invites Brown faculty to reflect on some of the current conditions in the US school system with respect to questions of race and ethnicity. Our host this afternoon is Dr. Tricia Rose, Chancellor's Professor of Africana Studies and Director of the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America at Brown. At this time, I'd like to invite Dr. Rose to introduce our guests. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. As our fantastic staff, Stephanie LaRue, Associate Director, just noted, this is part of a two-part series on educational inequality, and those two events are part of a broader framework of critical conversations where we invite our own colleagues here at Brown, as well as regional and more distant colleagues, to talk about urgent issues that need our attention. I just want to remind everyone that the second part of this series will be held in the spring on March 4th at noon, and will feature another cohort of amazing Brown faculty to talk about various issues. I say this because between the guests we have today, who've been so generous to spend their time during this very busy semester, and the ones that are going to do the same in March, we have an extraordinary cohort across a number of disciplines of colleagues who work on race and various forms of inequality in education, both in the US and comparatively. So, you know, the questions framing this particular discussion are intended to be broad to allow for a free flow of conversation and flexibility. When we planned this event, the critical race theory curriculum-based brouhaha was just beginning to surface. And so we've opened this discussion to be broad enough to include references and discussions of that. But overall, we're really trying to figure out whether or not, you know, public education and educational inequality in the US can really be this great equalizer and a pathway to opportunity. What are the new contexts of COVID and the ways in which that changes the landscape in particular? And then, as I mentioned, the battle over curriculum and what might be some best practices. So we're going to be able to cover quite a gamut here today. I'm going to give very brief introductions to our panelists, and I will give those comments, those short bios, in the order in which the panelists will speak. And then I will turn it over to the panelists, who will move between speakers on their own. No need for me to interrupt them every few minutes. And if you want more information, they're available on our website for longer biographical information. So our first speaker is Prudence L Carter, who's just arrived at Brown, and we're very delighted about that. And she is the Sarah and Joseph Jr. Dowling Professor of Sociology, and her primary research focuses on the explanations of enduring inequalities in education and society. Her books include the award-winning Keeping It Real, School Success Beyond Black and White, Stubborn Roots, Race, Culture, and Inequality in the US and South Africa Schools, and Closing the Opportunity Gap, What America Must Do to Give Every Child an Even Chance, which is co-edited with Evan Wellner. She's also the 2021-22 president-elect of the American Sociological Association. Jonathan E. Collins will speak next, and he is a recent member of the faculty here at Brown. He's as Assistant Professor of Education, Political Science, and International and Public Affairs. Jonathan's research focuses on urban school reform, local politics, race and ethnicity, civic engagement, and deliberative democracy. His research has been supported by the Spencer Foundation and the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences, and published in various peer-reviewed journals, including the American Political Science Review, Peabody Journal of Education, Political Behavior, and others. Andrea Flores is another dear colleague of ours who is an assistant professor of education as well. And she's a cultural anthropologist whose research interests primarily center on how education shapes immigrant and immigrant descendants' sense of self, transitions to adulthood, and social belonging in the United States. She's the author of Succeeders, How Immigrant Youth Are Transforming What It Means to Belong in America, which just came out this year, 2021. Congratulations to Andrea. And finally, we have Margo Jackson, who's an associate professor of sociology here at Brown and an affiliate of the Population Studies and Training Center, the PCTC, the Annenberg Institute, and Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy, as well as spatial structures in the social sciences. Her research focuses on the study of poverty and inequality among US children and families, and on the role of childhood circumstances in contributing to intra and intergenerational poverty. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Prudence Carter, and after the speakers speak as a group, we will open it up to discussion with you, our audience and participants. Thanks very much. Prudence, we're delighted you're here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Patricia, and thanks to the staff at CSREA for setting up this incredible event. I'm really excited about the time and opportunity to really engage with all of you today. And I thank those of you who've come out to listen to us as we engage about this, like one of the most impactful social, cultural, political institutions in our society, which is the institution of education. It is also the site of lots of human capital development. And yet we can know, and we can start off the bat, which I will talk about in my comments, is that education is not the panacea. Schooling is not the panacea to solve the large, gigantic problems, I should say, of social and economic inequality in our society. But it is a key link. It's a key conduit to it. And in the last several years, I have been culling scores and scores and scores of studies that transcend my own discipline and that span the spectrum of the social sciences, trying to come to understand how we explain and think about this large problem. What will it take? And I've come away with I'm arguing that multidimensional problems of educational inequality demand multidimensional solutions. And how I kind of configure this in my own mental structures about how to understand the big problems of educational inequality, particularly given the patterned, racialized and classed, and even in some cases gendered outcomes, is to think about this from macro, meso, and micro levels. Now, this is not a theoretical framework I'm talking about. In the social sciences, we know that this is a way to understand units of analysis. And there are several big points that are coming out in two major review papers that I've worked with colleagues from human development to philosophy and educational research over the last few years. And that is that we know we have to do something at the macro level. Some of this transcends what happens in schooling, but it also plays out and permeates the walls of schooling. And so the research is there. We can see it in the political sphere about the necessity to eradicate institutional and systemic racism, because the historical legacy of how this country, this republic came to be, manifests itself intergenerationally, and it has come to be racialized, and it feeds and fomates the kind of sustained, enduring racial and class inequalities that we're seeing in our society. So we also know through various studies that we are going to have a more equitable distribution of economic resources. And I know more will be said about that later. It is impossible to expect groups that have been historically disadvantaged and do not have the same pots of economic, and I should say income and wealth capital, to be able to compete fairly. Because we know that the resources that play themselves out in neighborhoods, communities, and schools are deeply aligned and highly correlated with economic resources in a learner or student's context. And we are also hearing more about wealth inequality. The wealth inequality manifests itself not only in terms of who can live in what neighborhoods and buy what homes, and where the local tax base actually affords the opportunity to build high quality schools, as they're called, but also who can actually stay on the trajectory for higher education. And there are really vast disparities among social groups in this country that are predicated, that are partly explained by the wealth inequality that exists. And we know that there are various historical, federally mandated practices and laws that engendered this kind of inequality. From history to economics to sociology, we see the studies. So then we move to the meso level about how this all, as I said, has actually created certain types of communities that we know, because those of us who are in the bands of privilege, those of us who are actually getting the kinds of outcomes we want for our children, know we wouldn't do without well-funded schools. Now, we may do without well-funded schools in racially and economically segregated communities, but the research is talking about why it's necessary from an economic perspective, not necessarily from a social psychological, although that's what the older research, what Clark and Clark had said, but it's not that Black and brown families necessarily need to sit next to white families because they are less than or perceive the other as better. It's because we know where the dollars flow, and there's highly correlated and aligned with where power lies. And so the research is making that argument, although I want to give an acknowledgement to my colleague, Michael Mary, with whom I'm writing a current paper for the Spencer Foundation, who argues against paternalistic integration, because that is what has played out in our society, in the sense that we expect groups to acculturate, to give up, and even, dare I say, in the current political moment, not even demand that we teach a holistic and inclusive curriculum when it comes to history and social studies and literature. So when I talk about what the solutions here, I'm talking about thinking about these in terms of the dissolution of thick social and symbolic boundaries that play themselves out because of the forces of racism, because of the forces of class and economic inequality. And these will require deep social, civic, and economic engagement across social boundaries. And that's one of the benefits potentially if we did it right. But at the moment, we know that the experiment of social integration in schoolings has not yielded the kinds of outcomes. And this is why those who are on the political conservatives have don't see a need for it. And I'll show you a slide in a moment about that. And even those who are on the progressive left are also arguing against it because it hasn't worked. But part of it, I would argue from my own research, is that it was never fully implemented in the way that we conceived of how integration could work. At the micro level, we have to also think about the increased beliefs about education as a public good. There are a number of social scientists, including my, and he will be on the panel in the spring, Lewis and Diamond, Leroy McCoy Lewis, many others who have written about opportunity hoarding from the middle and upper classes in our society. Schools, the schools that actually are the conduits for upward mobility and further advantage, have a certain ethnocultural, ethnocentric orientation, a certain cultural ethos. And part of the cultural narrative is one that's about social mobility that engenders the idea of individualism and getting as much as I can and competitiveness, which has really challenged the idea of education as a public good. We've made education more, as David Laborie and others have argued, a private good. And so in order to even change mindsets about how we do away with inequality, we're going to have to wrestle with this very philosophical idea. We're definitely going to have to eradicate interpersonal racism, prejudice, and bias. I'm not Pollyanna-ish and think that we can get rid of it full force, but it is the case that, and I've just read a very interesting book about by Heather McGhee called The Sum of Us, about how it is that even groups who could be more impacted in a positive and affirmative way by economic and social change are actually succumbing to racist ideas and belief systems because of the cultural narratives that have been generated by historically underrepresented groups and economically developed groups. So the investment in certain economic policies, the investment in certain educational policies is low because they perceive that those are going to take away from themselves. If some of the evidence, Jennifer Richardson and Maureen Craig have shown through social psychological experiments about how the barometers for cooperation around equality and reducing inequality change depending on whether or not people believe that this is going to be given more to Black and brown communities as opposed to white communities, middle class and affluent. And the reality is that what that has created is a zero-sum mentality that propagates bias, stereotype, and narratives that undermine a fuller, more inclusive is an institution of education in our society. And then also at the micro level, it is we know, and I've said this, and I keep saying this because I'm astounded by where we are today in 2021, that we know from the research, lots of educational research, that high quality teaching must encompass not only teachers who know how to teach math, science, English language studies and so forth, but those teachers also need to have a sociological and historical consciousness, and they need to be able to teach in a pedagogical way that is deeply inclusive via the curriculum, via their practice. But what we have now is a backlash and a pushback for even talking about structural racism in our society. And we can say more about that in the conversation. And I know that Jonathan may say more about that too. But we had this massive in the 80s and 90s, a push for increased critical multicultural education in the landscape. And now it's being countervailed for political purposes. There is a threat, there is a fear. So the social psychological really matters. And I argued, I wrote the other day on a social media post that we really need to actually understand why this fear is so deeply entrenched in communities right now. And part of the argument is because it's possibly this zero-sum mentality. There's not enough for all of us. So in my own work, I am arguing that not only that we have to think about the material resources and inputs to schooling, but we will not solve these problems. It's not enough to put students in schools where they actually have equal per capita. We're going to have to go inside of the schools to think about the sociocultural and political context as well, the substance of relationships, how group dynamics are playing themselves out, what happens in the family and neighborhoods when it comes to bias and prejudicial, racist and classist belief permeate those walls and create differential and even unequal situations and educational experiences within so-called desegregated or diverse schools. That's been my body of work for the last several years, that it is not going to be enough to pay attention just to the material context, but we're going to have to do, if we want to really solve the problems of educational inequality, deal with the intangible, some of the things that are less visible from the outside. So here are I'm going to end with some critical policy questions. The first one is, how do we gain traction on broader societal, macro level issues that provide equitable opportunities for historically, racially, and economically disadvantaged young people in their schools and societies? And from a social science perspective, I wonder, will social scientists, and I've written a paper with my colleagues Hiro Yoshikawa and Andrew Nalini, who's the lead author at NYU, will social scientists ever really contribute to radical reduction of inequality without attending adequately to how we reduce structural racism and systemic inequality in society? I don't believe we're going to solve the problem if we don't attend to the macro. There are many who say, well, we can't do anything about what lawmakers do, but those lawmakers actually go through schools. They're from communities. They are our neighbors. They are our church members and so forth. And how do we change via those social and cultural institutions? That's the meso level. And finally, is it really better for the democracy to aim for a well-implemented plessy, separate but equal, rather than a feebly received and mandated brown? We see from Pew Research data, I showed this last week on another panel, that the majority of Americans believe in local schools, not integrated schools. And that is racialized. There are racial disparities about that. Nearly 2/3 of whites believe that, compared to the opposite for Blacks. Hispanic or Latinx folks are half and half on this issue. And a lot of this is also ideologically and politically driven. So that's where I want to start, is that this is going to require us to think at it from, tackle it from a multidimensional perspective. And we can't all work on each part of the pie, but hopefully we can find a way for our work to be actually more aligned and congruous. And so I thank you for listening, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Jonathan Collins.
Wow. Thank you, Prudence, for such a thoughtful presentation. It was great to see because, you know, in addition to being a colleague, I'm such a huge fan of her work. And so to be able to see it all placed in a larger context, into a formal conversation was really compelling to see. And so, and I think the words that I'll share will complement what we just heard. And so, you know, I think the questions for this panel is really important, you know, which is, how has education failed Black and brown and poor children? And what are the new hurdles that are particularly presented by COVID-19, and then the larger environment? And so I think one way to think about what's happening, especially for Black and brown children and poor children, when it comes to successfully navigating our school system, is that it's starting to feel, or you could argue it's continued to feel like defying gravity, essentially the equivalent to doing the impossible. And so, you know, our educational system has created, we can think of it as kind of a gravitational pull that grabs our Black and brown students and drags them, you know, to the bottom. And I'd argue that gravitational pull, that force, is actually largely rooted in the surrounding politics. And so, you know, if we look backward, this is a pretty easy concept to grasp. You know, by now we've become familiar with the White Citizens Council in the US South, who during the Jim Crow era essentially institutionalized efforts to deny Black families access to the ballot box and adequately resource schools. So in fact, council leaders typically made a point to see that the names of any Black person who attempted to register to vote or sign petitions for school desegregation, that they made their way to the local newspapers so that whites in the community would know which Blacks to fire, turn off their tenant farms, or deny credit, even kill. What's noteworthy here is that the strategy to maintain and even advance white supremacy has, like other strategies, been rooted in public shaming and violent threats. And it's that public nature and its aimed towards state and local policy that makes it an explicitly political project. It is white political organizing explicitly around the preservation of privilege. It is what Charles Mills calls the racial contract, or as he puts it, an in-group agreement among the privileged to restrict moral and political equality to themselves and maintain the subordination as unequals of the outgroup. This runs parallel to when California passes a public referendum in 1998 called Proposition 227 that essentially outlawed English, Spanish bilingual instruction and required that all instruction be conducted in English. This was a public campaign where supporters, like an organization called English for the Children, spread false attacks and misinformation about the impact of bilingual instruction, fear-mongering the state of California about the potential impacts of empowering brown kids who speak Spanish. It's an agreement that has been preserved by any means necessary. It's the agreement that led to violent assaults in Boston, to the setting of fire of empty buses in Louisville, Kentucky, and the harassing of little Black children throughout the South, to where Ruby Bridges famously walked through the doors of an all-white school with a shield of agents from the US National Guard. The violence, the carnage, the rage, the gravitational pull, it's the politics. And what we're seeing is that the gravitational pull has gotten stronger. And so what I'll do is I have a short video that I'd like to show.
What had been planned as a typical school board meeting in Virginia's wealthy Loudoun County this week devolved into pandemonium. With hundreds of parents flooding an auditorium to accuse the school system of teaching their kids that racism in America is structural and systemic, something the school board denies is part of the curriculum. Things got so heated that the board members eventually walked out, leaving the police to deal with the unruly crowd. 2 people left in handcuffs.
This is an unlawful arrest. I have a First Amendment right.
Loudoun County School Board has been roiled for months by accusations that it has embraced critical race theory, a school of thought that maintains that racism is ingrained in U.S. law and institutions, and that legacies of slavery and segregation have created an uneven playing field for Black Americans. The Loudoun school system says it is simply training teachers, the majority of whom are white, to be culturally responsive to serve the county's increasingly diverse student population. The tensions in Loudoun echo a larger battle playing out across the country as Americans tackle racial and social injustice in the wake of the police killing of George Floyd last year. The idea that CRT, as it's known, is infiltrating public schools has become a rallying cry for conservatives who, like many in Loudoun, say it is being used to indoctrinate children that America is a racist country.
Critical race theory is anti-white, and it's not American.
Others, however, see it simply as fact.
Would you not teach what happened during World War I or World War II or the American Revolution? No, you wouldn't. We need critical race theory because we need real history.
Proponents of CRT argue there's no evidence it's being taught in most, if any, of America's public schools. Instead, they say, it is being used by conservatives as a catch-all term and a way to push back on schools' efforts to support racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. Several Republican-led states, including Florida, Texas, and Georgia, have enacted new rules to limit teaching about the role of racism in the U.S. But several teachers and education experts worry that rules banning CRT or limiting discussions on racism could have a chilling effect on efforts to teach Black history, including the legacy of slavery and race relations in the U.S.
And so as we can see, the gravitational pull has only gotten stronger. I want to tell a quick story about a recent research endeavor that very much relates to the video we just saw. And so I initiated a survey on education, politics, and policy during the pandemic because I was curious about how political attitudes were shaping during such a crisis, such a time of crisis. Whose kids are experiencing learning loss? Who's being impacted by COVID? How is it impacting preferences for schools to open or close, support for various health protocol? Are people willing to engage with school boards? But it was a unique moment. Racial injustice protests were happening all over the world, and conversations about teaching the history of racism in schools, this was starting to peak over the horizon. And so I asked a question about the latter during the survey in August 2020, and then I did a replication in January 2021. The statement in the survey, quote, all schools should feature curriculum that teaches kids about the history of racism in the United States, end quote. During both iterations, over 70% of the respondents expressed support, close to 80% actually of respondents expressed support. And so I thought, well, perhaps the CRT debate is overblown, or maybe my data is just bad. But then I received a direct message from a survey respondent who declared, I don't have a problem with teaching kids about racism, but what I don't support is that critical race theory. So that's what they were responding to, not the essence of the curricular change, which isn't even happening in mass. People are responding to the political project that CRT has become. It's not about student enlightenment. It's about preserving the racial contract, about maintaining the gravitational pull. So what are the solutions? The solutions in closing gaps in achievement or increasing student performance, these are relatively straightforward. Small classrooms, low student to teacher ratios, engaging curriculum, inquiry-driven and tailored curriculum that really center the learning styles of Black and brown children, data-driven and nuanced assessments that don't carry punitive consequences, exploratory environments that are structured not for social control, but for cultivating democratic participants. And throughout the course of this conversation, we'll hear more solution-oriented ideas that there is strong evidence that tells us it works. But reaching those solutions requires a certain kind of politics, a politics of mutual respect and civility, or what Danielle Allen calls, quote unquote, political friendships across lines. But it's a political friendship that has to offer empowerment for Black and Brown students and their families. According to the latest round of NAEP assessments, only 9% of Black students on average tested as quote unquote proficient in civics. This is lower than the proficiency rate for Black students in math and language instruction. This belies the fact that civics instruction still carries its limitations that we have yet to fully address, but it suggests that the same problem will continue, that the ability to respond with the proper politics, to develop what Michael Dawson calls the Black counterpublic, is becoming further and further out of reach. How do we achieve this? Oversight and intervention. We've seen this in education before. We've seen state and federal court intervention for desegregation, school funding equalization, student discrimination. The big question is, will we see that now? I want to close with the inspiration for the gravitational pull analogy. I have a 5-month-old daughter, and what I've noticed is that she loves when I toss her up a few inches and just immediately catch her. I see the fear during that split second of suspension, but then there's this indescribable joy of knowing that she's been caught. At 5 months, she understands the enormity of divine gravity. But for many of our Black and Brown students, the politics pulls them down constantly, and the institutions have not been there to catch them from falling. And so when we think about some of the biggest problems that are facing our Black students, our brown students, our poor students, it's the gravitational pull. And the question that we have to continue to ask ourselves is, will we create the kind of system that needs to be in place to catch them? And that concludes my remarks. And I will now allow us to transition over to my colleague, Andrea Flores.
Wonderful. Thank you for the introduction to Patricia or Tricia, excuse me, and to Prudence and Jonathan for sharing some really great insights here that I think will provide context to me as an anthropologist interested in the micro. I thought I would focus my remarks on where I've conducted research since 2010, Nashville, Tennessee, and to give you a sense of how racialized inequality manifests in schools and has over that period from beginning my research to this year. And so, but I wanted to start, and I apologize to those of you who have been at events where I've shared this quote before, but in the description of this event, there was it started by saying that people still believe that education is the great equalizer, and that we have plenty of evidence that suggests it does not. But my research was conducted with a college access program for Latinx youth, who 50% of whom were undocumented. Another sizable percentage were the children of recent immigrants. And so this was at an event that schools were presenting to this college access program, or students were presenting as representatives of their schools, their universities and colleges, about how they got there, their paths to college. And one young man said the following quote, right, that he learned a lot about himself. If you have the will, the determination, that fire inside you to be something more, make your parents proud. College is hard, but it's going to make you a better person. And then he pointed to a flag in the corner and mentioned that it was their responsibility as Hispanic Americans to do so. So here, certainly we see a lot of those individualistic notions of success and belief in the meritocracy, but I also want to point out that there's a connection to family here. There's a sense that education matters to these young people and matters about them. And later, a student who was more of a troublemaker, was talking to the program coordinator about his vow to now stop misbehaving and go to school. And when he said what that kind of all rolled up to, he said he wanted to be somebody. So I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that despite the fact that educational inequality exists, is persistent and pernicious, it doesn't mean that education doesn't hold these other values and that it's worth reinvesting in this public good. And as Prudence pointed out, the idea of getting others on board with understanding that as well to prompt that reinvestment. So as I mentioned, my research is in Nashville, Tennessee, and this is just a little collage that I've made. And we might be more familiar with a place like Nashville in terms of country music, wild bachelorette parties going from honky tonk to honky tonk, but it also has a central place as a site of new migration, and more historically, a site of historically Black colleges and universities that were the site of early civil rights activism with folks like Diane Nash and John Lewis. And I would also like to point out in these final three pictures on the bottom here that there is youth activism still today in Nashville. And these pictures were from a protest to preserve DACA that had come. The 10 attorneys general had tried to rescind DACA, or deferred action for childhood arrivals, which provided a stay of deportation and work permits for young people who met certain measures, and enabled them to kind of have what Cecilia Menjivar talks about as a liminal legality, something that is renewed as this legal status, but one that doesn't actually give you the full entitlements and rights of citizenship. And while we may have views of places like the South as backward, particularly in light of recent the CRT debates, but I'd like to point out here that Tennessee actually pulled out of the suit to challenge the legality of DACA, not least of which was due to the youth organizing. It's also young people have pushed for in-state tuition for undocumented students. That hasn't happened in Tennessee yet, but in the last vote, it was down to 1 vote, which I think also points to this idea of these macro politics and the policy world do stem to an individual. And so there is connection on the micro, macro, and meso levels. So this is to give you a sense of where we were and where we might be headed in Metro Nashville Public High Schools, which is the large school district that serves the learners that I worked with. And we can see in the early 2000s, when there was a steady influx of Latinx migrants and migrants from around the global South, that the graduation rates were pretty dismal all around. There was steady improvement, but here I think we can also see what folks have turned about kind of the measurement issue here. I think we can say it seems highly unlikely that you go from a 61% graduation rate to an 80% graduation rate in 1 year without some statistical funny business happening. And what I saw during the time that I was there was what's referred to as the push out of minority and ELL and immigrant students, where in one case, a young woman who was a Somali migrant came with a nonprofit organizer, one of her teachers, to meet with the principal of her school, because there was a push. She was not likely to graduate on time. She would have been 19, and that was kind of it seemed like age was a way that they were pushing people out, and she was an English language learner. And the principal asked, in 2 minutes, tell me why I should let you stay here. And she went on to describe she didn't want to be doing her night job forever, which was working with her parents as an evening custodian in the schools. And so we see here this young person, due to the advocacy of her teacher and the nonprofit organization who were helpful in scheduling this meeting, this young person got to stay in their school rather than, as I saw with many of the adult ELL learners I worked with as a volunteer in an adult education center, letters were coming out from the school district that many parents were misunderstanding as that their child would not be able to continue with school. So when we look at the rates here, the graduation rate in more recent times, we see that there have been some drop-offs to COVID in the district that go back to some of those historical lows, especially for English language learners. But I want to get even more micro than this. I want to talk about one of the most diverse high schools in Nashville, Tennessee that gets a lot of media attention. It's in the southeast corridor of Nashville in an area that was historically working class white, but was one of the first areas where Latinx migrants moved in. And then there's also a strain of migration from refugee populations because starting in 2001, Nashville was part of the Building the New American Community initiative that resettled refugees in sites that historically have not been sites of resettlement, but have a significant have sufficient economic resources and job opportunities to permit settlement. And about 1,000 refugees a year are resettled in Nashville. So Glencliff High School quickly became very international with these two streams of migrants. And I should say that there's residential segregation in the city, so migrants tend to live in the same part, the South. There were tensions between these populations as the school diversified in the early 2000s. But as you can see from the bottom picture there, the school adopted the motto, "Our diversity is our strength," and has a very popular International Day where students put on a 2-day fundraiser for the Model UN Club that draws students into it may be in more of the soft multicultural curriculum that we've seen that doesn't actually get to questions of systemic racism. But I would also point out that when they choose the nations to be represented, they are representative of the populations in the school. And we see, for example, Iraq represented, but also Kurdistan, places that aren't national in the system of global nation states, but are being advocated here as a cultural and national group worth recognizing. It also has a very successful Best Buddies program that pairs developmentally diverse young people with developmentally normative people. And again, this is another community event that is quite well attended. But we can see in the year following the COVID pandemic that graduation rates have gone down to the level seen in the early 2000s. And it's particularly dire for English language learners who are graduating at less than half. And if we look a little further, when we look at English language proficiency over time, and they use an exam called the WIDA test that kind of gives a sense of how many people are, how much gain you have made in your language development. And we can see a sharp drop off, as certainly we've seen nationwide, right? That the educational interruptions due to COVID have particularly impacted low income emerging bilinguals who may not have access to technology as much as their peers, and also are struggling to learn kind of the language of computers and the language of their new nation. In the midst of this, Tennessee has banned critical race theory and was one of the first states to do so. And I would just like to kind of point to, this is one of the statutes in August. The ban went through in May, and in August, an 11-page document went out with exactly how this was to be implemented. And this is one of the things that was particularly put out as something that that could not be taught in school, that a meritocracy is inherently racist or sexist or designed by a particular race or sex to oppress members of another race or sex. And I think we can look at the outcomes that are happening in schools like Glencliff and wonder, despite the fact that there is this belief, right, about schools that persists among the young people who may go to these schools, that their schools are not being set up to help them learn, to help them achieve. But however, as Jonathan mentioned kind of with his survey, it dovetails nicely with this, that is allowed, right? You can teach about historical oppression of a particular group based on these outcomes. How one can teach that without thinking about systemic racism is unclear to me. But it became clear when I was reading some coverage about the debate on the state House floor about how about the passage of this set of statutes. The representative from Knoxville, Tennessee, one of the representatives from Knoxville, Tennessee, Justin Lafferty, was discussing how certain historical moments are being taught, and that he felt it was inappropriate that, well, I'll just read what he said. By limiting the number, he was talking about the 3/5 compromise. By limiting the number of population in the count to only count enslaved people in the South as 3/5 of a person, they specifically limited the number of representatives who would be available in slaveholding states, and they did it for the purpose of ending slavery. Well before Abraham Lincoln, well before the Civil War. Do we talk about that? His colleagues clapped in the Republican, he's a Republican, and his Republican colleagues clapped. Later, Representative Antonio Parkinson, who was a Memphis Democrat and chairman of the General Assembly's Black Caucus, stated, Representative Lafferty's statement about how the 3/5 compromise was created to end slavery was alarming. But the real insult was when the House Republicans clapped for him when he finished his diatribe. I think we can see the failure of our curriculum to produce, as Prudence mentioned, sociological and historically minded ability to think critically about the historical oppression of a particular group. To get to what the outcomes of what the punitive costs are to this, the first violation reported from a district results in the Department of Education withholding 2% of the annual state funds, or $1 million. The second violation is 4% or 2 million. 5 or more is 5, can withhold up to 10% of the annual state funds, or 5 million, whichever is less. Recently, Nashville Public Schools enacted a larger budget than was anticipated of almost $1 billion. Glencliff High School gets 13 million. If we think about a $9 million violation here, we can see how these macro structural concerns about how educational funding is divvied out. We can see that it comes down to these, sometimes can come down to these individual pedagogical moves that are increasingly being managed from not a space of thinking about how to improve our students' learning, but how to politicize it. And questions about where to go from here, thinking through the research that I've conducted and the people that I've come to know and love in Tennessee, I turn first to that people matter. Educators matter and deserve control over the curriculum. I saw firsthand what that meant when Tennessee has a very regressive tax structure, where there's an incredibly high sales tax, including up to, I believe, a 6% tax on food in grocery stores, but no income tax. I saw a math teacher do a curricular unit that had students look at what percentage of income went to taxes based on consumption patterns, and saw students see what that tax burden looked like, and showed them the ways that inequality manifests in buying a jug of milk. And I would also say that it's important that the almost $1 billion budget this year went to increase salary, where a minimum wage was $15 an hour. I also would like to point out that when I first did this research, largely with the young people that I mentioned in the College Access Program, they were in high school. It was 2012 to 2013. Since then, I've seen many of these young people go on to work in nonprofit capacities, work as teachers, work as advocates for their schools, including serving on boards that look to assist their schools in this partnership program with local businesses. I think when these young people mentioned that they wanted to be somebody, it wasn't just limited to them providing for themselves individually, that they saw the falseness of an individual success-driven meritocracy and have increasingly defined being somebody as being someone for somebody. In addition, as I mentioned, grassroots political organizing, we've seen the effect of that in Tennessee. There's also, given the population change, we've seen that redistricting might have an effect in Nashville. And unfortunately, we also see how that may pit Black and Brown communities against each other, with North Nashville, which has been historically Black, potentially losing sites as the population pull has been more in the immigrant South. We also see the complexities of race in this context, where we have Black migrants, like the young woman I mentioned, being in the South and disconnected from the historical Black community in the city. Nonprofit partners, I think, despite the fact that they are I don't think that we should be wary of I think we should be wary of a private solution to the public good, but the program that I worked with mattered. And I think I saw through that a way that they can be integrated into providing the type of wraparound community services that vulnerable learners need. And finally, the state has passed a bill that allows school board members to run with a political party. Is partisanship an answer? I don't know. I leave that to Jonathan as the political scientist, but I think what it does lay bare is that education is political, and that ignoring it and saying that education is a nonpartisan issue does nothing to remove the systemic inequality that learners face. I will now turn it over to Margo.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you. Thanks so much to Tricia for inviting me to participate on this panel. It's always fun to have a chance to learn from my colleagues. And that's particularly because I come to this panel as somebody who studies inequality of educational opportunity among children, and in particular, the role of public supports in reducing inequality among kids. And so I'd like to center my comments, my kind of brief comments today, around a fairly specific idea, which is that in thinking about how to reduce educational inequality, and in particular gaps by race and income, we should be looking to the period of early childhood, which is where a lot of that inequality is produced. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Jon Stewart's new show on Apple TV called The Problem, I think, with Jon Stewart, but I've only seen one episode. And on a recent episode, Derek Hamilton, who's an economist at the New School, was one of the panelists, and he very nicely kind of broke down this idea that education is not a panacea, right? This is something that Prudence discussed as well. And I'd kind of like to double down on his point and emphasize, in addition, that schools are not a panacea when we think about reducing educational gaps by race and income. And there are many reasons for this that are far too complex for me to talk about in 10 minutes, including, of course, structural racism in the form of residential segregation, rising income inequality over the last several decades, persistent levels of poverty that are disproportionately experienced by Black and Latino children. Again, something that Prudence nicely summarized as well within her framework. And so the reason that I'd like to focus on in my time today is the fact that a large portion of the educational inequality that we see during the school years is developing before kids enter school. And so I'd like to kind of offer a couple of illustrative points that reinforce some of the key facts related to this as part of my argument today. And the first point that I'd like to make is that a lot of the inequality that we observe, as I said, during the school years is produced before kids begin formal schooling. And so this is an illustrative example taken from a study that was published about 10 years ago, but this looks very similar today, which shows that if we look as early as age 3, right, so before kids are even starting preschool, there are really striking gaps, in this case, across educational groups in children's cognitive development, right? And we can see that in the top line here, kids whose parents have a college education have much higher cognitive development scores in this very early period compared to their peers whose parents have less than a high school education. Here I'm showing you this result for cognitive development, but this graph would look very similar if I showed you other markers of academic achievement or measures like health, right, and other forms of developmental milestones that we can observe during childhood. Another way of thinking about the same point is summarized in this graph, which is taken from a research team at Rutgers University. And what this group has done is to try to quantify the size of early education gaps by race and income. And they do that in the form of estimating the months of learning, right, by which children are disadvantaged at the start of the school year. So this is at age 5. And if we just look at the darker bars here, which is the case of math achievement, we can see the top bar here shows that the gap between African-American and white young students is about 9 months of learning. The gap between Hispanic and white students is about 11 months, and the gap between low income and higher income students is over 11 months as well. So again, another way of kind of reinforcing the same idea that from the earliest days of the school years, we see very large developmental gaps already. A second kind of threshold point that I'd like to introduce, which is related, is that these gaps in what we kind of refer to as school readiness are much higher here in the United States than they are in other rich democracies. So here I'm just showing you a kind of small segment, a small selection of countries, but we can see that in the United States, which is this bar on the left, the gap in children's early reading skills is very large, right? A full standard deviation. And that is much larger than we see in the case of the UK, in Canada, and especially in Australia, where the gap, this gap in reading skills at age 5 is about half the size as it is in the United States. And then a final kind of, again, threshold point that I'd like to make in terms of understanding some of the relevant key facts here is that gaps in children's educational progression and school readiness are not kind of immutable or irreversible social facts, right? And in fact, the size of these gaps is highly variable over time. So if we look here at this graph, and you can ignore the kind of data points around this line, but if you just focus on the line, you can see that the income gap in children's academic achievement, in this case, represented by the difference between the richest 10% of families compared to the bottom 10% of the income distribution. This gap has always been large, right, going back to the 1940s when we could first measure it, but it's grown fairly substantially over time. Okay, so this is the case of income. And if we look at racial and ethnic gaps in achievement, we can see similar kind of variability over time. In this case, actually kind of in a positive direction, right? If we look at the left here, we see the white-black gap in achievement, and we can see that it has declined steadily across decades. And we see a similar pattern with respect to white Latino achievement gaps, okay? So the reason that I'm showing you all of these graphs is not to overwhelm you with, depressing information about how much inequality there is, although that's important to know too, but to make the point that, as I said, these gaps in school readiness and in educational inequality more broadly are not irreversible and they're not immutable. And if we acknowledge the idea that the majority of educational inequalities are developing in children's earliest years, right? In fact, even before they enter school, then we should be thinking very seriously about how public supports before school can play a really critical role in reducing these large gaps that we see. The fact that disparities are significantly smaller in other countries than they are in the United States, and even that gaps in the United States have changed dramatically over time, I think suggests that public supports can make a big difference. And so I've loosely categorized these types of supports with respect to policies to support children's early learning, so things like preschool and public preschool, policies to raise family incomes and reduce poverty, as well as policies during the school years to improve the way that teaching and learning happens, as others have discussed on the panel. And so just to kind of show you a few examples, right, of how these policies work. To take the case of early learning, right, this is that same group of researchers that I showed you from Rutgers University. And here what they've done is to take those estimated gaps in the number of learning months lost by race and by income. And they've kind of done a thought experiment, a simulation to see how much would those gaps be reduced if we implemented universal pre-K, for example. And what we can see here is that the 9 months or so of learning disadvantage that in this case, young Black children have compared to white children, overall in the US, is expected to decline by about 50%, almost 50%, after the implementation of universal pre-K, right? And we can see similarly, if we look at the graph on the right and just focus on the case of math, which is the darker bars, we see a less substantial reduction in the case of income gaps, but still a sizable reduction in gaps in school readiness following the implementation of universal pre-K. So it's still difficult in the US to fully understand the effects of policies like universal pre-K because most states do not have universal pre-K yet or at all. But growing evidence does suggest that these types of programs can dramatically reduce gaps by race and income with respect to school readiness. And there's also some really interesting evidence from particular cities and pilot programs like the case of Boston, where we see very long run effects of programs like universal pre-K as well in terms of increasing college going and future educational attainment as well. Similarly, policies to increase family income and reduce poverty are extremely effective in reducing educational gaps. And so here I'm showing you in this graph the effects of a very large income support program, the Earned Income Tax Credit, which has very large long-term effects on the likelihood of low-income children graduating from high school. So what we see here is that the effect of the Earned Income Tax Credit on the likelihood of graduating from high school is quite large among the lowest income families. And it declines, although it's still positive, as we increase across the income distribution. Okay? My own research shows that this effect occurs in part because of the greater ability of low-income parents to spend money on developmental items for children when they are living in a context of robust public supports for their family. And it's also important to point out that in this highly federalized system in the US of the US government, where there is massive state variation in not only how much money states spend on kids, but how they choose to invest the money that they receive. The implementation of income support and poverty reduction policies in the US can be highly racialized. And so this is a really interesting example from a paper that was just published for the case of cash welfare, which is the TANF program in the United States, which demonstrates that states that have a larger Black share of their population, as we see here, are much more likely to spend their TANF money, which is again cash welfare support for low-income families. They're much more likely to spend that money on family structure related types of investments, namely incentivizing marriage and reducing the likelihood of single motherhood, than they are on providing direct cash assistance to families who qualify for the program. And in fact, those types of decisions at the state level about how to spend money result in a smaller reduction in child poverty in those states than in states that prioritize the provision of cash flowing from these types of income support programs. And so that leads me to my last point today, which is that in order for early childhood policies to achieve the drastic inequality reducing effects that we know that they are capable of, they have to be widely accessible and evidence-based. So I've just shown you one way in which policymaking is less effective when it is motivated by not what works, but by instead racialized perceptions and understandings of family life. But it's also equally important to be thinking about reducing the striking amount of unmet need that exists among American children. So here is one of many examples which shows that only about 40% of children who are eligible for public preschool programs in the United States, like Head Start, end up enrolling in those programs. And these numbers are similar for other types of public supports like SNAP or WIC, for example. And so as we think about ways to reduce educational inequality through public investment, we need to better understand and address the reasons why children are not able to access the services for which they're eligible. And as a final note, I think I'll just end with the point that although public investments in children, which include educational investments, have grown over time, as we can see from this blue set of bars at the bottom, they are perennially under threat in the United States. And in fact, they are projected to decline, even as we have increased and continue to increase spending on other portions of the population. And so if we think about the potential for these investments to drastically reduce inequality by race and income, this is a very serious problem. So I will stop there and I think turn it back to Tricia, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Margo, Andrea, Jonathan, and Prudence. Wow, this was just such a dynamic conversation. I have a whole bucket load of questions, but before I sort of begin to pull things out of that magical bucket, let me remind our audience members that the Q&A is available and open for you to place your questions. There are a few there, but we're happy to receive a few more. We have about 22 minutes to talk. And I'm sure we'll have more than that in our question and discussion. But let me sort of get everyone going, maybe in conversation with each other for a moment and share some of the things that came to mind when I was connecting the presentations, which I thought was so fantastic because it showed a range of ways into this problem. You know, the theoretical context, the policy context, the sort of, the perception of oneself from, the actual student perspective that Andrea gave us. And then, these fundamental sort of underlying nagging frameworks that are defining it. So I'm going to try to tie them together a little bit and see what you all have to say about it. So it'll be an open question for the whole panel. So, this question and problem of inequality, everyone's tackling it from these different angles, as I pointed out. But the thing that I think is really the challenge is how do we connect the pieces that you are each bringing? That is to say, what do we do with the intangible factors that Prudence is talking about, right? In the context of, Margo's presentation, which, says, look, here's the evidence, right? We know what works, well, why aren't we doing it? And, Jonathan might say to that, well, because there's this sort of intended gravitational pull, which is an amazing phrase, by the way, to create certain kinds of circumstances. And so, I guess what I'm really curious about is to think about, if Prudence is right, that we're sort of struggling with this kind of separate but equal, but not really equal, as we know, context for education, basically, how do we solve this problem? It's not just about money. It's not just about figuring out what works. right? I mean, it's really something much more complicated than that. So, but we also want to take seriously, and I just want to go back to Andrea's, presentation for a minute, take seriously how Black and Brown people have invested in education, right? Just because the institutions have been so terrible and failing overall, right? Not everyone and not all, but overall, doesn't mean that nothing good has happened and that there's nothing worth investing in from young people's perspective. But with that said, what do we do with this gap, right? How do we solve, how do we advocate and produce this change, right? Given what these sort of gaps are illuminating, from ideological to structural to policy to the intangible. So anyone is I'm eager to hear sort of how you might put those pieces together.
Well, Tricia, I'll start since I spoke first and I haven't spoken in a while. First, I want to say that the kind of conceptualization of the problem is highly undergirded by a lot of research across the disciplines. There's so much evidence about what the problem is. And the evidence is both quantitative and qualitative, and the intangible is often picked up through ethnographic and interview research, right? So I want to be clear about that, and I certainly have written papers with scores and scores and scores of citations of studies, empirical studies. My work is empirical, it's theoretical per se. And I can tell you that in even the course of looking across two societies in 8 high school studies, looking at an entire population of high school students, that we can see when people actually approach it from a policy perspective of feebly implementing diversity per se, what the outcomes are. They look like uneven educational experiences. Now, the main point for me is not to say it's either or, but it's both and. There is a calculus. The model is complex, but it is also multivariate. So we do need universal policies, for example, and targeting the very early part of the developmental trajectory matters. That will reduce inequality, absolutely. But relative inequality in our society will maintain itself across racialized and class boundaries if we don't attend to other aspects of social interactions and engagement. And so that's the point that I'm saying. It's not to say that we don't look at the material and we don't use universal. We actually know, just based on how the whole so-called integration movement has played out, right? And folks are asking, well, why didn't it work? They were in better school context, right? We were busing them across. Then look what happened inside the schools when the kids got there. Okay, but it is the case that hungry kids can't learn. So we need to have better food programs and reduce food security. Homeless children, right? Housing needs to be better. Just the basics. Middle and upper income families are already or 200 yards ahead because they already have the basics. What these types of programs will do is get to a basic standard of living, but will it reduce the relative inequality? It will reduce the absolute, absolutely. And so I'm saying that it's multifocal, it's multivariate, and it is all evidence-based. Yeah.
Jonathan, Margo, Andrea?
I'll jump in, and I completely agree with Prudence. Multi-pronged approaches, thinking about this as an extremely multivariate problem. And then I think, for me, the issue is how it can kind of get thrown into the sort of abyss of politics, and the accuracy of information doesn't matter. The precision of data estimates don't seem to matter. And so I was on a panel at a state legislature's convention like a couple of weeks ago. And I presented this study from Margo Jackson, who is at Northwestern, who did this study about the effects of school spending. And I'm giving them the methodological details. I'm explaining to them the takeaways. I think one of the big takeaways was that per $1,000 increase in spending over 4 years, you can expect about like a 2 percentage point increase in high school graduation rate. Boom. And yet the extent to which legislators were hearing the data and evidence very much depended on their ideological tent. And so if we can't get the leaders who are making policy to acknowledge the common, sort of the common nature of like the evidence that fuels our pathway towards equity, how do we actually approach how do we actually even, not even multivariate approaches, how do we tackle one variable at a time if we can't get them to agree on the extent to which investing in schools in and of themselves has this benefit? How do we begin to tackle other challenges like language immersion, right? Like I'll pass it on from there, but that's kind of where I struggle with it.
Yeah, yeah.
One thing that I would just add, and I don't know that it's an answer as much as you know, an additional complexity, I guess, is, you know, I've been reading lately about, and I'm sure we all have in different places, about the fact that, you know, a lot of the policies and approaches that we've been talking about in different ways today to reducing inequality are actually incredibly popular at the national level, right? Like the majority of Americans, you know, thinks that there's too much inequality, favors some form of redistribution, you know, supports the implementation of pretty universal, broad-reaching policies that are meant to reduce poverty, et cetera. But of course, as we know, we don't implement those policies, right, with rare exceptions. And so I've been thinking a lot lately about that disconnect between political opinion, and Jonathan probably knows much more about this than I do, but the disconnect between kind of views about social policy on the one hand, and the kind of high levels of political polarization that make it very difficult to implement things that are actually pretty broadly popular. And at least from my sociological perspective, it seems that one reason for that has to do with the fact that people are increasingly separated from each other, right? Because of growth in segregation, you know, by race and by income, that make it really difficult actually for people to even understand, you know, the circumstances of other people, but also make it difficult or kind of built into the legislative process and the way that, you know, people get elected, et cetera. So again, that's more of a kind of thought than an answer, but it seems relevant.
Well, let me jump in here real quick. Andrea, I'm not forgetting about you in case you want to follow up. But, you know, for me, what's interesting about what you're all saying here is, and I'm not sure I'm in agreement with it, which is good for conversation, which is sort of like, this is a matter of kind of, you know, political ideology that's, you know, dividing us. But what I would argue is that the political ideology is a stand-in for a racial ideology, and that it's not about left and right, it's really about black and white. So that if you were to say, for example, yes, you know, Margo, you're absolutely right. People say we're all for universal, you know, access to, you know, resources for people until it looks like black and brown people are going to benefit. And the reason they're going to benefit is because they're at the bottom, because that's what they've been gravitationally forced to be. So there you have, like, well, they're going to benefit. Well, we don't want it. Look at Jonathan's, what's his last name, book, I'm Dying of Whiteness. Can't think, no, that's someone else. I can't think of his last name.
Metzel.
Metzel, thank you. I knew there was a Z in it, a weird memory approach. But this concept where where on the one hand, there's an ideal of a kind of universal collective whole, when it actually plays out on the ground, what we often see is this huge resistance and gap. So when Jonathan said that, you know, they're fine teaching about racism, but they don't want to teach about CRT, that means is they're fine with racism about the past, which is also what came up in Andrea's slides, right? About, well, yeah, there was racism then, but this is now. And, you know, CRT is about now. CRT is also about then. But anyway, so you see my problem here. It's like, you know, it's almost like we want to see this as a sort of a solution-based problem, but the core of it is something I think much more difficult to get at. I mean, that's just my sort of, you know, interventionist, you know, pokey moderator thinking. But I do really worry about it. Anyway, Andrea, let me let you go, and then if someone wants to follow up, we'll take that, and then I'll have a couple questions here from the audience.
No, I think that's right. I think you can't disentangle that issue, right? Like you can't, when we're talking about racialized inequality, it is about race, right? And I think for the young people that I worked with, it was about a lot of their educational aspiration was tied to not conforming to racialized stereotypes about them, right? And about Black and brown people generally. So, I mean, I think that to my mind, how to connect these pieces is also by equally valuing I mean, as Prudence put it, right? Like there's lots of empirical data here about what works and what matters. But I think part of it is also because we think of it because we want to think about it as having a silver bullet, we tend to prioritize, as we see with standards-based reform, like if we can measure it, we can fix it. But I don't think that gets to this question of the intangibles and understanding how racial ideologies play out, right? And how how people act on those in policy, right? It's not a neutral ground. And so I think that when we think about it being a multi-pronged effort that needs to promote reform, we also need to value the types of knowledge created around education to look at how a teacher's individual racial ideology impacts how they teach. That's and right. How that affects how, Justin Lafferty votes about CRT.
Mm. Right. Yeah. Nobody wants teachers to change their pedagogy at all, right?
But meanwhile, there are economic studies that have followed up after decades of more ethnographic studies to show that ethnic studies actually has an impact. The teaching of high quality ethnic studies has an impact on the positive outcomes of achievement and performance. Tom D and Emily Penner have seen that. They've shown that. Now it's really interesting. For many years, Gloria Ladson-Billings and a whole camp of teacher education researchers were arguing that the dream keepers, the type of teaching, what you were offering. But it's, unfortunately in the academy, there's a stratification of knowledge as well, because it wasn't until positivist science brought it in that now we look at it. But isn't it interesting that despite the fact that there is evidence, the politics now say we're still not going to teach it? You have states legislating against the very thing that has been shown to be effective. So I just want to put that out there.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing, right? The GI Bill,
exactly.
Great equalizer. No, we're narratively, so that we can have the narrative of full access, but on the ground, none whatsoever. So that's so much of the gap where we are. I'm going to take some questions because I know they're really good, and I don't want us to run out of time. So what I'll probably do is maybe have two of you respond to one and two of you respond to the other, so we can get a few of them in. So first question is from one of our visiting fellows for the year at the center, and her name is Gwendolyn Purifoy. And the question is this: the idea of the gravitational pull is phenomenal. Can the panelists, so I'm going to say Jonathan and maybe one other panelist, discuss how the ability to achieve height, to go up and up with only your inadequacy as a stopping point and susceptible to a gravitational pull centered in whiteness, and how fights against educational equality is a fight to keep whites appearing superhuman and able to defy gravity? Meritocracy is a part of this, and equality disrupts this imaginary. So this is, can the panelists discuss the ability to achieve height, to go up and up with only your inadequacy as a stopping point? That's the concept. And that this is centered in whiteness, and how fights against educational equality is a fight to keep whites appearing superhuman and able to defy gravity, basically. So Jonathan, why don't you start? And then Andrea, why don't we let you take the other half of that? Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's a sort of beautifully worded question, because it really captures the essence of what I was essentially trying to argue. And well, I think we'll never know the full answer until we at least create the conditions for that to be the case, for Black children to just essentially be able to soar on their own sort of ability, their own sense of their own sort of relative level of adequacy, inadequacy, however you want to frame it. I mean, that's the goal. And, it's up to, I think the biggest thing that I want to say is that it's not just a fight against educational equality, it's kind of this larger fight for racial justice that engulfs educational equity during particular moments. And so, you know, school desegregation wasn't just about schools, it was about desegregation broadly construed, and then it was engulfed. The schools, the educational system was engulfed into that. I think the same thing is happening with CRT, mask mandates, all these other things are happening, and then CRT sort of gets engulfed. So it's, going back to Trisha's point about this really being a nomenclature for a racial divide, what we're just seeing is that education kind of becomes this prime space to sort of pick from that tree. And how do we prevent that from happening? How do we inoculate education from that?
Right. Yeah.
We can't.
Yeah, I think what this made me think about is Vivian Louis' work, Compelled to Excel, and the kind of notion of how Asian American achievement is predicated in the model minority myth on anti-Blackness, and also how this isn't just something that continues to center whiteness, but continues for migrant origin students to center forever foreignness, right? And also when we see, she beautifully writes about how these young people feel about their achievements and it never being enough, right? Even the ones who do achieve going to Columbia, right? That's it's a feeling of emptiness, because I think that achievement is asking you to see your racial difference in a particular way that is difficult. So in some ways, like, the ability to climb up the ladder doesn't erase the kind of internalization of harmful racial ideologies. So I think we can also think about this question here as not just centering whiteness, but what does it decenter for our young people themselves? And it also makes their educational achievements hollow in some ways, because it asks you to pull at something very close, your family, the people that you love, the communities that you belong in.
Yeah. So we have two questions. One is super complicated, and the other is very sort of straightforward. So I'm going to, well, gee, what do we have? 3 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to go for the super complicated, but I'm going to ask Prudence to be the only one to answer this, unless someone else is just really dying to jump in. And then Margo, I think this other question is largely to you. So I'm going to tell you both questions. Prudence will go, and then Margo. So when I was going through middle school and high school, this is for Prudence, and for me, I'm adding it for Prudence. In middle school and high school, I saw that foreign-born Black and Brown students were overrepresented in honors and AP courses. I'm assuming that means as compared to non-foreign-born, not as compared
Native,
to
yeah.
Native, thank you. Now my daughter's observing the same thing. Is there any evidence that foreign-born people of color experience racism and inequality differently from US-born people of color? And the question from Margo is, have there been studies regarding childcare and preschool providers' education or lack of education, and how this affects the ability of children to gain needed skills for further educational success? Okay.
So thank you for that. It's an excellent question about the differences. And what I like about it is, one, is it illuminates the heterogeneity of Blackness, because we get homogenized so much. Two, it talks about intersectionality, right? And three, it allows us to amplify what opportunity gaps, how opportunity gaps and family resource differences can engender the kinds of achievement disparities we see. Pamela Bennett and Amy Lutz have a great paper in the Sociology of Education that's in response to commentary that the legal scholar Lonnie Grenier and Henry Louis Gates, African-American scholar, a study scholar, English literary scholar at Harvard made. Everybody knows Skip Skates, but they talked about the observation in elite selective schools that we see a huge ratio difference between foreign-born Blacks or those who are Native, whose grandparents were born in this country and who were the descendants of slaves. And it is the case, according to Bennett and Lutz's analysis, that foreign-born or children who are those who are the children of immigrant Blacks in this country have a higher probability of being in those upper echelon classes and going to selective colleges and schools. And how they understand it is because the human capital context is so different in the family. For example, many people don't know, although it's a very small immigrant group in this country, that Nigerians have the highest per capita rate of PhDs among fathers than any other immigrant group in the country. So, and when you look at the diaspora, even if income is not as great once the parents have actually immigrated here, they come with a lot of educational achievement and attainment. The same is the case for many immigrants from China and Latin and Central America as well.
Interesting, really interesting. We opened up a can of worms at the end. Margo, Margo, you could just comment on that, and then we'll just thank everyone quickly and close it down. Go ahead, Margo.
Sure, yeah, no, great question. And just briefly, I guess I'll say, I'll actually put in the chat, since we obviously don't have time to address fully this report that's very comprehensive, that addresses this issue of kind of preschool quality, right, which is talked about a lot. And I guess I would say the consensus, at least from my reading of that literature, is the answer to your question is yes. Interactions with teachers matter a lot, and I think it's safe to say are considered to be kind of one of the key indicators of quality within preschool education. And in particular, kind of the idea is that preschool teachers matter to the extent that they can cultivate stimulating or supportive interactions, right, with kids. And so I guess I'll just end by saying I think that's particularly kind of important to think about in the context of what I'm sure you've all been paying attention to, which is the absolutely abysmal pay, right, that we give early childhood education providers, and the high amount of turnover that creates within early education settings. That makes it really difficult, right, for teachers to achieve that type of bond and connection with students. So I'll refer you to this report to get a lot more information about that.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And of course, fatigue and exhausting other factors. Well, I know we've got to go. Did you, Andrea?
I just wanted to
very quickly.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up the point that Prudence was mentioning about the Nigerian students. I anecdotally, and I went to Harvard as an undergrad, and there was a Nigerian student whose family was quite prominent politically, but he still got stopped by campus police, right? So there is an equality of opportunity, but remains that inequality of experience.
Yeah. Well, yes, indeed. Those things are both true. It's a both and, to quote my new colleague, Prudence Carter. Okay, it's great to see everyone. Thank you so much. I don't want to hold up our audience. Thank all of you for really terrific presentations. There's so much to deal with here. We'll come back in March and do some more. We hope you'll be part of that audience this time, and I hope to see you all in person soon. Thank you everyone for coming. We really appreciate your support, and just be thrilled about who we've got here at Brown. Thanks everyone.